Sometimes reality turns out to be more chilling than any horror movie, and this story is a perfect example of that. Imagine this: a luxurious home, a perfect couple. He's a successful businessman, she's a charming and confident woman, a glamorous life full of wealth and style. But here's the twist. Behind that shiny facade were secrets dark enough to send a shiver down your spine. I want to tell you about Mike and Susan Royell, a couple everyone saw as the epitome of success, but only they knew the dark secrets hidden behind the walls of their home. No one could have imagined that one cold February night, everything would end in tragedy. A call to emergency services and accusations that would make your skin crawl. You know what they say, the devil is in the details, and this story proves it. Because it was the little things, texts, casual words, red droplets on the floor, that came together to paint a picture you just can't look away from. From millionaire Mike Royell and his wife Susan were often seen out together, dining at high-end restaurants and vacationing at luxury resorts, projecting the image of a flawless married life. Their mansion in the upscale neighborhood of Naples, Florida, sparkled just as brightly as their idealized union. A well-maintained garden, a shimmering pool, sleek, modern interiors. It seemed like everything Mike touched turned to gold. And Susan, his trophy, was no exception. But behind those walls were deep cracks, ones that even the most skilled designer couldn't conceal. Mike's success in business had made his name known in certain circles, but his personal life remained shrouded in mystery. Rarely did anyone hear about his past, a past that led back to his days as a young student at the University of Florida, where he met his first love, Dee Hoffman. At 19, he was already building ambitious plans and climbing the career ladder. And their youthful romance turned into a marriage that lasted a quarter of a century. Dee spoke of him as a kind and reliable man, one who never raised a hand or even his voice. But a thriving career had its cost. Mike became a workaholic, spending months away on business trips, leaving his family in the shadow of his job. This eventually led to their quiet divorce in 2005. Dee moved on, but the echoes of the past did not. Soon Susan stepped into her place. A young nurse Mike met through an online dating site. She was 38, and she caught his attention from the very first messages. Her energy, charisma, and zest for life were magnetic, and without hesitation, he invited her into his world. Before long, Susan had moved in and taken the place that once belonged to Dee. In August 2007, they got married, and from that moment, the mansion once filled with memories of Mike's first family became the home of a new union. However, on February 3, 2018, before dawn, the calm of this new life was shattered. A call to emergency services broke the silence, and Mike's shaky voice reported a break-in. An unknown intruder, masked and armed with a knife, had attacked him and his wife. Police and paramedics arrived quickly, but what they found would raise questions that would eventually destroy the image of the perfect couple. When police arrived at the Royell residence, the mansion looked strangely calm. The garden was quiet. The lights were still on, and the polished rooms looked almost untouched. But inside, something was terribly wrong. Susan was injured. Mike was injured too, and Mike had a story ready. According to him, a masked stranger had entered their home during the night. The intruder had attacked the couple with a knife before disappearing into the darkness. At first, it sounded like a terrifying home invasion, but investigators quickly noticed something unusual. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no damaged doors, no clear evidence that a stranger had broken into the house. Still, the investigation was only beginning. And to understand what may have happened that night, detectives had to look beyond the crime scene. They had to look at the marriage itself, because Mike and Susan had not always lived the glamorous life people saw from the outside. By 2015, serious tension had begun to grow between them, and one of the biggest sources of that tension was Mike's daughter, Caroline. Susan reportedly felt that Mike was giving Caroline too much attention. Caroline, on the other hand, believed Susan was trying to push her out of her father's life. The conflict became increasingly personal. And then Caroline began planning her wedding. Mike wanted to give his daughter the wedding she dreamed of. He initially agreed to contribute around $100,000. But as the plans grew bigger, so did the cost. Eventually, the wedding reportedly cost around $250,000. For Caroline, it was her wedding day. For Mike, it was an opportunity to give his daughter something special. But for Susan, the amount was difficult to accept. She believed Mike was spending far too much money on Caroline. And beneath the argument about money was something much deeper. Susan wanted to feel that she was the most important person in Mike's life. Caroline represented the part of Mike's life that Susan could never completely control. And that created an increasingly bitter conflict. By the time Caroline's wedding was over, the relationship between Mike and Susan had reached a dangerous point. But neither of them knew that their next major argument would change both of their lives forever. Because just weeks later, Mike would tell his daughter something deeply disturbing. He claimed that Susan had physically attacked him. And according to him, it wasn't the first time. There had already been an incident involving a knife. The perfect marriage was beginning to look nothing like the picture they had shown the world, and the question was becoming impossible to ignore. If the Royells were really the perfect couple everyone believed them to be, what had actually been happening inside that mansion? Because the answer would soon lead investigators to a night filled with blood, lies, and a story about a masked intruder that would eventually begin. The perfect marriage was beginning to look nothing like the picture they had shown the world, and the question was becoming impossible to ignore. If the Royells were really the perfect couple everyone believed them to be, what had actually been happening inside that mansion? Because the answer would soon lead investigators to a night filled with blood, lies, and a story about a masked intruder that would eventually begin to fall apart. But before that night happened, there had already been warning signs. And one of the most important people in this story was Mike's daughter, Caroline. Caroline had never been comfortable with Susan's place in her father's life. She believed Susan wanted too much control over Mike. And Susan apparently felt that Caroline was taking too much of Mike's attention away from their marriage. The tension between the two women became a constant source of conflict. Mike was caught in the middle. He loved his daughter, but he also wanted his marriage to work. And every time he tried to keep peace between them, the situation seemed to get worse. Then came Caroline's wedding. Mike wanted his daughter to have the wedding she dreamed of. He initially agreed to spend around $100,000, but as the plans grew bigger, so did the cost. The guest list grew, the expenses grew, and eventually, the final cost reportedly reached approximately $250,000. For Caroline, it was her wedding day. For Mike, it was an opportunity to give his daughter something special. But for Susan, the amount was difficult to accept. She believed Mike was spending far too much money on Caroline. And beneath the argument about money was something much deeper. Susan wanted to feel that she was the most important person in Mike's life. Caroline represented the part of Mike's life that Susan could never completely control. And that created an increasingly bitter conflict. A few weeks after Caroline's wedding, Mike finally opened up to his daughter. What he told her shocked her. According to Caroline, Mike said Susan had physically confronted him during arguments. He showed her photographs of injuries he had taken after some of those incidents. Caroline had also noticed a faint scar on her father's face around the time of the wedding. And then came another disturbing revelation. Mike said Susan had once attacked him with a knife. The incident had resulted in Susan's arrest. For Caroline, this changed everything. She had already disliked Susan, but now she believed her father might actually be in danger. Still, Mike remained in the marriage, and that raised another question. If the situation was really this serious, why didn't he simply leave? The answer would become one of the most important questions of the entire case. Because years later, the prosecution would ask the jury exactly the same thing. The tension finally exploded again. The argument centered around Caroline and the enormous amount of money Mike had spent on her wedding. Susan was furious. According to accounts later presented in the case, the confrontation became physical. A phone was thrown, furniture was disturbed, and Mike was struck. But then something unusual happened. Susan called the police herself. When officers arrived at the mansion, they found clear signs that a serious argument had taken place. The atmosphere inside the house was tense. Susan was emotional. Mike appeared distressed. The officers spoke to both of them. After hearing what had happened, they decided Susan should leave the residence temporarily. The goal was simple: separate the couple, let everyone calm down, and prevent the argument from becoming something worse. Susan agreed, at least verbally, but she didn't immediately leave. Instead, she remained inside the house. She wanted to talk to Mike. She wanted to convince him that their marriage could still be saved. For the moment, the situation appeared to settle down. But the underlying problems hadn't disappeared. They were still there, waiting. By late 2017, Mike and Susan's marriage was becoming increasingly unstable. And then came a night that would become crucial to the entire case. Mike and Susan went out to dinner. From the outside, it looked ordinary. A wealthy married couple having dinner together. But behind the polite appearance, their relationship was falling apart. They argued again. And once again, Caroline's name came up. Susan remained angry about the money Mike had spent on the wedding. To her, the issue was no longer just about $250,000. It was about what the money represented. Mike had chosen to spend a huge amount on his daughter, and Susan felt that decision said something about where she stood in his life. Mike eventually became frustrated. He left the restaurant. Susan remained behind. But the argument wasn't over. A few minutes later, she sent him a message. The message was direct. She told Mike she was filing for divorce. There was no more pretending, no more trying to hide the cracks. The marriage was coming to an end. But Mike's reaction to the possibility of divorce would soon become a central part of the investigation. Susan continued sending messages. She accused Mike of having serious problems with his daughter. She made it clear that she would not accept what she believed was his behavior. And then came the words that would later become important evidence. She wanted a divorce. She wanted out. After sending the messages, Susan returned home. The mansion was quiet. The night was dark. And neither of them could have known how much those final messages would matter. Because investigators would later examine their communications carefully. Every argument, every accusation, every threat, every emotional message. They were all pieces of a much larger puzzle. At that moment, however, Susan simply went into the house. She eventually went to the guest room. Mike was elsewhere. For a while, everything was silent. But sometime after midnight, Mike went to the guest room. And whatever happened next would change their lives forever. Mike entered the room. Susan was there. The conversation quickly turned into another argument. But this argument was different. The emotions were no longer controlled. Years of resentment were suddenly boiling over. The failed marriage, the arguments about Caroline, the money, the possibility of divorce, the accusations. Everything came together in a matter of minutes. And then a knife became part of the confrontation. Susan would later say that Mike attacked her. Mike would eventually tell a very different story. He claimed Susan had been holding the knife herself. He said she was threatening to hurt herself. According to his version, he tried to stop her. A struggle followed. And during that struggle, Susan was seriously injured. But Susan's account was completely different. She said Mike was the aggressor. She said he stabbed her intentionally. And she claimed that the injuries were not the result of an accident. Two people, one room, one knife, and two completely different stories. But the most shocking part was still to come. Because after the violence, the couple allegedly agreed on another story. A story about a stranger, a masked intruder, a man who supposedly entered their home during the night. a story that Mike would tell the police. And for a brief moment, Susan went along with it. But once she reached the hospital, everything changed. Because away from Mike, Susan finally had a chance to tell someone what she said had really happened. And when investigators heard her story, the case took a completely different direction. The perfect marriage was no longer simply a troubled relationship. It was becoming a criminal investigation. And the next question was terrifying. Who had really been holding the knife that night? And why was Mike so determined to make investigators believe a stranger had done it? The answers would begin to emerge when police returned to the mansion and started looking for evidence of the mysterious intruder. What they found would make The answers would begin to emerge when police returned to the mansion and started looking for evidence of the mysterious intruder. What they found would make the story even darker. Because the more investigators searched, the harder it became to believe Mike's version of events. Susan was rushed to the hospital with serious injuries. She was frightened. She was in pain. But for the first time that night, she was away from Mike. And that changed everything. Doctors began treating her injuries while investigators tried to understand what had happened. At first, the story was still the same. A masked stranger had broken into the house. The couple had been attacked. But Susan eventually told investigators something very different. She said there had been no stranger, no masked burglar, no mysterious attacker hiding in the darkness. According to Susan, the person who attacked her was Mike. She told investigators that the argument had escalated inside the guest room. And then Mike had used a knife against her. She claimed that after the attack, Mike tried to convince her to follow his story. They were going to tell police that someone had broken into the house, but Susan was no longer willing to remain silent. The moment she felt safe enough to speak, she told her side of the story. And now investigators had a major problem. They had two completely different versions of the same night. Mike said they were victims. Susan said Mike was the attacker. Only one story could be true. Investigators returned to the Royell residence. This time, they weren't simply looking at the house as the scene of a home invasion. They were looking at it as a possible crime scene. They examined the doors, the windows, the locks, the rooms, every possible entrance. And almost immediately, something didn't fit. There were no convincing signs that a stranger had forced his way inside. The windows were intact. The locks showed no obvious damage. There was no clear evidence of a masked man entering the mansion. The supposed intruder had apparently managed to enter without breaking anything, and then, somehow, disappeared without leaving behind the kind of evidence investigators would normally expect. The story was becoming harder to believe, but investigators still needed more. They needed something that could connect the physical evidence to the timeline, and that led them to the security cameras. The Royell home had a security system, and normally, that could have been one of the most valuable pieces of evidence. But there was a problem. Parts of the footage were missing. Some recordings had been deleted. Mike later acknowledged that he had turned off or deleted portions of the surveillance footage. His explanation was that he was afraid investigators would misunderstand what they saw. But investigators had a different question. Why would someone who had just survived a violent home invasion intentionally destroy surveillance evidence? If a masked stranger had really attacked the couple, the footage could have helped identify him. It could have shown how he entered. It could have shown where he went. It could have shown how he escaped. Instead, portions of the footage were gone. That didn't prove everything by itself, but it added another suspicious detail to an already complicated investigation. And then investigators found something even more important. Not all of the footage had disappeared. Some recordings remained, and those surviving images would help investigators reconstruct the hours before the attack. Investigators obtained surveillance footage from the restaurant where Mike and Susan had dinner. The footage showed the couple arriving, but they did not look like a happy married couple. They were distant. Their interaction was tense. And eventually, they left separately. That detail mattered, because Mike had described the night as an attempt to reconcile. but the restaurant footage showed a couple whose relationship appeared to be falling apart. Susan left. Mike left separately. And later, they returned to the mansion. They went toward different parts of the house. There was no obvious sign of a third person following them. No mysterious stranger. No masked figure. No indication of a home invasion. Instead, the evidence suggested something much more personal. The danger may have started after the couple returned home. And now investigators began focusing more closely on the relationship itself. Mike continued to insist that an intruder had attacked them. But every new piece of evidence created another problem. If a stranger entered the house, where was the evidence? If the attacker forced his way inside, why were the doors and windows intact? If the intruder escaped, how did he leave? And why had parts of the security footage been deleted? Investigators began comparing Mike's statements with the physical evidence. And inconsistencies started appearing. The story wasn't holding together. But investigators still needed to understand what happened inside that guest room. They examined the blood evidence. They looked at the injuries. They studied the positions of objects inside the room. They reconstructed the possible sequence of events. And gradually, the idea of an accidental struggle began to look less convincing. The evidence suggested that this wasn't simply a chaotic accident. There had been violence, and someone had tried to hide what happened afterward. Mike eventually gave investigators a detailed explanation. He said that after the argument at the restaurant, the couple returned home separately. Later, he went to the guest room to speak with Susan. According to Mike, he found her holding a knife. He claimed she appeared emotionally overwhelmed and was threatening to harm herself. Mike said he tried to stop her. A struggle followed, and during that struggle, the knife allegedly moved between them. Susan was injured. Mike was injured too. According to his version, everything was accidental. He said he was simply trying to protect his wife. But there was a major problem. Why would they then tell police that a masked intruder had attacked them? Mike claimed that Susan was afraid. She didn't want to be blamed. She didn't want to go to jail. So, according to him, they decided to create the intruder story. But investigators didn't see it as a desperate decision made by two frightened people. They saw it as a possible attempt to cover up a violent attack. Inside the guest room, investigators found blood in several places. The bed was stained. There were blood traces on the floor. There were also stains on nearby surfaces. The scene suggested movement. It suggested a struggle, and prosecutors would later argue that the blood evidence was inconsistent with Mike's claim that Susan had simply injured herself. The injuries themselves also became important. Medical experts examined Susan. Her wounds were serious, and the prosecution argued that the pattern of the injuries suggested intentional violence rather than a simple accident. Mike's defense disagreed. They attempted to show that the injuries could have occurred during a struggle. The case was now becoming a battle between competing interpretations of the same physical evidence. But there was one thing that was becoming increasingly difficult for Mike to explain: his actions after the incident. He had deleted surveillance footage. He had reported a fictional intruder, and investigators believed he had attempted to shape the crime scene around that story. To prosecutors, those actions looked like consciousness of guilt. To the defense, they were the actions of a frightened man trying to protect himself and his wife. The jury would eventually have to decide which explanation made more sense. As the evidence continued to build, investigators became increasingly convinced that Mike's story was false. Eventually, Mike Royell was arrested. The successful businessman who had once lived a life of luxury was suddenly facing the possibility of spending decades behind bars. And his first reaction was not what investigators might have expected. He called his daughter, Caroline. His voice was shaken. He insisted that he hadn't done anything wrong. He wanted her to believe him. He wanted her to help find a lawyer. Caroline was placed in an impossible position. She was his daughter. She had already heard his side of the story, and she knew about the problems between Mike and Susan. But now her father was accused of attempting to kill his wife. The man she knew as her father was suddenly at the center of a criminal case. And outside the family, the news spread quickly. Friends were shocked. People who knew Mike described him as calm and successful. His former wife, Dee Dee, was also stunned by the accusations. For years, she had known Mike as a quiet and reliable man. Now he was accused of something she could barely believe. But prosecutors saw a different Mike. They saw a man who had become desperate as his marriage collapsed. A man facing divorce. A man worried about his money. A man who may have believed that losing control of his marriage meant losing control of his entire life. And now the case was heading toward trial. The question was no longer simply what happened in the Royell mansion. The real question was why. Why would Mike risk everything? Why would he create a story about a masked intruder? And was money really the motive? Or was there something even deeper behind the attack? The courtroom was about to reveal the answer. As the trial began, both sides presented completely different pictures of the marriage. The prosecution argued that Mike had a motive. His marriage was collapsing. Susan wanted a divorce. And divorce could have serious financial consequences. Mike had spent years building his wealth. He had businesses, property, investments, and a lifestyle that depended heavily on the assets he had accumulated. According to prosecutors, Mike was terrified of losing control. They argued that he couldn't accept the idea of Susan leaving him and taking a significant portion of what he had worked for. But the defense saw things very differently. They argued that Mike had been living in a deeply troubled marriage. They presented Susan as controlling and emotionally unstable. They pointed to her previous arrest after an alleged confrontation with Mike. They also presented messages she had sent to him. Some of those messages were angry, some were threatening, and some suggested that Susan had been struggling emotionally. The defense wanted the jury to believe that Mike had been trapped in a destructive relationship. They argued that Susan had repeatedly accused him of being unfaithful. They said she had tried to control his relationship with his daughter, and they pointed to messages in which she expressed thoughts about self-harm. According to the defense, these details supported Mike's claim that Susan could have injured herself during the confrontation. But the prosecution had a simple question. If Mike was really afraid of Susan, why had he stayed? Why had he continued living with her? Why hadn't he simply left? And perhaps most importantly, why invent a story about a masked intruder? That question became one of the central issues of the trial. Mike's lawyers knew they needed more than an emotional explanation. They needed evidence. So they presented forensic testimony about the blood evidence found inside the guest room. A forensic expert examined the blood patterns and offered an interpretation that supported parts of Mike's timeline. The expert suggested that the blood evidence indicated the injuries happened later in the night. The defense argued that this was consistent with Mike's account, but Susan's attorneys challenged the analysis. They questioned the expert's methods. And then something even more damaging came to light. The expert's professional history was brought into question. His credibility had already been damaged by previous ethical problems, and the defense presented information that made the jury question whether his conclusions could be trusted. Suddenly, one of the strongest pieces of evidence supporting Mike's version became much less convincing. Susan's attorneys argued that the blood patterns were consistent with deliberate knife attacks. They claimed Mike had restrained Susan and controlled the situation. They also argued that the injuries Mike suffered could have been part of an attempt to make his story appear believable. In their version of events, Mike wasn't an innocent husband caught in an accidental struggle. He was creating evidence to support a false story. There was another piece of evidence that prosecutors found particularly significant. Mike had been looking toward a future without Susan. Investigators discovered evidence that he had registered on dating websites. He had been communicating with other women, and some of those interactions suggested he was already thinking about life beyond his marriage. That discovery created a serious problem for his claim that he was desperately trying to save the relationship. If Mike was truly trying to reconcile with Susan, why was he exploring relationships with other women? The prosecution argued that this showed his marriage was already over in his mind. They suggested that Mike wanted Susan out of his life, but he didn't want the financial consequences of divorce. That gave prosecutors a possible motive. They argued that he may have believed eliminating the problem was easier than facing the consequences of ending the marriage. The defense rejected that interpretation. They argued that dating websites didn't prove murder or attempted murder. They said Mike could have been confused, unhappy, or simply looking for emotional support. But the jury had to consider the entire picture: the messages, the financial disagreements, the arguments, the injuries, the deleted surveillance footage, the lack of evidence showing an intruder, and the story Mike had given to police. One piece of evidence alone might have been explainable. But prosecutors argued that when all of those pieces were placed together, they formed a clear pattern. Mike had a motive. He had an opportunity. And after the attack, he had allegedly attempted to cover it up. The defense continued to argue that Susan's injuries were the result of a struggle. They pointed to her emotional state. They pointed to her previous behavior. They argued that Mike had been afraid of what Susan might do. But Susan's attorneys pushed back. They reminded the jury that Susan had survived serious injuries. They argued that she had no reason to invent a story that could destroy her own marriage and expose her to public scrutiny. And they emphasized what happened after she reached the hospital. Away from Mike, Susan immediately began telling people what she claimed had really happened. To the prosecution, that was important. She had an opportunity to maintain the intruder story. Instead, she abandoned it, and her accusation against Mike became the foundation of the case. The courtroom became a battle over credibility. Who was telling the truth? Mike or Susan? The jury had to decide whether Mike's explanation of an accidental struggle was believable, or whether the evidence showed that he had intentionally attacked his wife and then attempted to conceal what he had done. The more the trial continued, the more difficult it became to separate the truth from the competing stories. Both sides had evidence. Both sides had witnesses. Both sides had explanations. But ultimately, the jury had to decide which version best matched the physical evidence. And then came one of the most important moments of the entire trial. The prosecution returned to the timeline. The couple had argued at dinner. They had returned home separately. Susan had told Mike she wanted a divorce. Later, they were together again inside the mansion. Then Susan was seriously injured, and shortly afterward, Mike called emergency services and reported an intruder. To prosecutors, the sequence was too convenient. They argued that the intruder story had been created after the attack to protect Mike from the consequences. The defense maintained that Mike had panicked. They said he was trying to save Susan and protect himself. But then there was the deleted surveillance footage. Why destroy evidence? That question followed Mike throughout the trial. The defense tried to explain it, but the prosecution used it to suggest that Mike knew the footage could contradict his story. The case had become more than a dispute between husband and wife. It was now a question of whether a successful businessman had deliberately constructed a false reality to escape responsibility for what happened inside his own home. And as the trial moved toward its conclusion, the jury had one final task. They had to decide whether the evidence proved that Mike was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Mike sat in the courtroom knowing that his entire future depended on those 12 people. His freedom, his reputation, his life outside prison. Everything was at stake. And after weeks of testimony, arguments, evidence, and conflicting stories, the jury finally left the courtroom to deliberate. For Mike, the waiting began. For Susan, another chapter of her life was about to close. And within only a few hours, the jury would return with a decision that would change Mike Royell. For Mike, the waiting began. For Susan, another chapter of her life was about to close. And within only a few hours, the jury would return with a decision that would change Mike Royell's life forever. The jury entered deliberations. 4 hours later, they had reached their decision. Mike Royell was found guilty. The successful businessman who had once appeared to have everything was now facing decades behind bars. the jury rejected the story of the mysterious masked intruder. They rejected the idea that everything had simply been an accident, and they found Mike responsible for the events that had taken place inside the mansion. In December 2019, the court handed down his sentence: 30 years in prison. 30 years. For a man who had spent decades building a successful career and living a life of comfort, the sentence represented an extraordinary fall. The mansion was gone from his daily life. The luxury was gone. The freedom was gone. And the carefully built image of the successful businessman had been replaced by the reality of a prison sentence. Mike appealed the verdict, but the appeal did not change the outcome. The conviction remained, and Mike remained behind bars. But even after the trial ended, the story did not completely disappear. After Mike was taken into custody, allegations began circulating that he had discussed having someone harm Susan even while he was incarcerated. The claims were disturbing. If true, they suggested that the conflict between the couple had not ended with Mike's arrest. Investigators reportedly looked into the allegations, but ultimately, there wasn't enough evidence to bring new charges against him. The allegations remained part of the public discussion surrounding the case. For Susan, however, the priority was different. She wanted the marriage to end. She wanted to leave the past behind. After Mike's arrest, Susan moved quickly toward divorce. The relationship that had once been presented as glamorous was finally coming to an end. But divorce wasn't simply about signing papers. There was property. There were financial interests. And there was the mansion. The same mansion that had once symbolized their success had become a painful reminder of everything that had happened. Susan wanted her legal share. Mike, even from prison, fought through his attorneys over the property and financial issues. The legal battle continued long after the criminal trial. But for Susan, the house meant something very different than it had before. It wasn't simply a valuable piece of real estate. It was the place where she had been attacked. The place where she had feared for her life. The place where her marriage had turned into a nightmare. Susan had survived the attack. But surviving does not mean returning to the life you had before. The physical wounds eventually began to heal. But the psychological damage could not simply disappear. The person she once trusted had become the person she accused of trying to kill her. And the home that was supposed to be a place of safety became associated with fear. That is one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. From the outside, the Royell home looked like everything people dream about. Beautiful, expensive, comfortable, secure. But inside those walls, the marriage was falling apart. The arguments were becoming more intense. The resentment was growing. And eventually, the conflict turned violent. The case raises a difficult question. Was money the real motive? Was it control? Was it resentment? Was it the fear of divorce? Or was the marriage simply the result of years of unresolved conflict finally reaching a breaking point? There may never be a single answer. But one thing is clear. The problems did not begin on the night of the attack. They had been building for years. The arguments over Caroline, the disagreements over money, the accusations, the alleged physical confrontations, the threats of divorce, the emotional messages. All of those moments created a relationship filled with tension. And eventually, that tension exploded. Perhaps the most important lesson from the case is how misleading appearances can be. Mike and Susan had money. They had a beautiful home. They traveled. They went to expensive restaurants. They looked successful. From the outside, their marriage appeared enviable. But appearances tell only one part of a story. A photograph cannot show what happens after the camera is turned off. A beautiful house cannot reveal what happens behind closed doors. And a successful public image cannot erase private problems. The Royells had spent years creating an image of a successful life. But when investigators began looking closer, that image started to collapse. Mike had once been a businessman, a husband, a father, a man who had built a comfortable life. But one night changed everything. His freedom disappeared. His marriage disappeared. his reputation disappeared, and the future he had imagined for himself was replaced by a prison sentence. 30 years behind bars. For Susan, the outcome was different. She survived. She escaped the marriage. But she also lost the life she thought she had. The scars from that night were not something a courtroom verdict could erase. So what do we really see when we look at the story of Mike and Susan Royell? A story about money? A story about marriage? A story about control? Or a story about what happens when years of resentment are allowed to grow behind a perfect facade? Perhaps it is all of them, because the most frightening part isn't the mansion. It isn't the knife. It isn't even the story of the masked intruder. It's the fact that the warning signs were already there. The relationship was already broken. The trust was already disappearing. And both sides were carrying years of anger and resentment. By the time the police arrived that February morning, the perfect marriage was already gone. All that remained was a crime scene, and a story that investigators had to unravel piece by piece. Imagine that mansion again. The beautiful garden, the swimming pool, the expensive interiors, the quiet rooms. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. But now you know what happened there. You know about the arguments. You know about the divorce. You know about the knife. You know about the blood. And you know about the story of the intruder. A story that investigators eventually rejected. The mansion was supposed to be a symbol of success. Instead, it became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when love turns into resentment, when trust turns into suspicion, and when control becomes more important than letting go. Mike Royell lost his freedom. Susan Royell lost her sense of security, and everyone around them was left to deal with the consequences. In the end, this story isn't really about wealth. It isn't about status. And it isn't about having the perfect marriage. It's about what happens when problems are hidden instead of confronted. Because every secret has a cost. Every lie creates another lie. And eventually, the truth finds a way through. The Royell mansion may have looked perfect from the outside, but behind those walls was a completely different story. And sometimes, the darkest crimes don't happen in dark places. They happen in beautiful homes, behind closed doors, where nobody